welcome everyone. I'm very excited today to be introducing Professor Aaron Jakes. Before I do that, I just wanted to acknowledge the co-conveners who've organised this series of seminars and events, so Sarah Casaz and Matin Biglari, and our assistants as well, so João Da Silva at the back, and Ada Ferretti, whose birthday it also is today, so happy birthday to Ada. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Aaron Jakes, who is a professor in the Department of History and the newly formed Committee on Environment, Geography and Urbanization at the University of Chicago. Prior to arriving at Chicago this fall, he was Assistant Professor of Historical Studies at the New School. He received his PhD from NYU's Joint Program in History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies. His first book, which many of us have read today, Egypt's Occupation, Colonial, Economism and the Crises of Capitalism, was published with Stanford University Press in 2020 and received honorable mention for the Middle East Studies Association's Roger Owen Book Award. He's currently working on a new project, A Long History of the Suez Canal's Many Roles in the Production of Global Inequalities Over the Past 2 Centuries, which he has tentatively entitled Tilted Waters, The World the Suez Canal Made. And his latest article, Peaceful Wars and Unlikely Unions, the Azhar Strike of 1909 and the Politics of Comparison in Egypt, is forthcoming with comparative studies in society and history, and maybe up on their website as early as tomorrow.
Maybe.
So
yeah.
Everybody check that out. So without further ado, I'd like us to give a round of applause to Aaron, who's joined us today.
Thanks, Henny and Tasada and Matin for inviting me. This is actually the very first time that I've gotten to talk about this book with an actual room of people. And it may very well be the last time I get to do that. And I am just incredibly grateful to be here, and frankly can think of no place that I would rather get to talk about the book once with a group of actual people. So thanks for inviting me. Publishing a book in the middle of a pandemic can be weird. Before I start, I wanted to say something that I've been thinking about and looking at the incredible lineup of speakers that you all have brought, and that was that this series marks and advances what I think is a pretty significant shift in the field that, for those of you that are relatively new to Middle East studies, may not actually be immediately obvious. So over the course of these months, you're going to hear from a whole group of scholars who, for the most part, do actually understand themselves to be writing and thinking, albeit in generatively diverse ways, about race and capitalism. But even a few years ago, when I was completing the manuscript for this book, the first term of that couplet was by no means obvious or widespread within Middle East studies. Indeed, to offer just one telling personal example of what this could look like, in response to my argument that what I call colonial economism can and should be understood as a historically specific form of racism, one of the reviewers for Stanford University Press questioned the choice to describe this discourse in terms of race rather than essentialism. In a somewhat crabby response to the press, I noted that race was in fact the chosen category of the historical subjects whose thought I was describing, and that Lord Cromer in particular wrote about the government of subject races, not the government of subject essences. But the bigger point here is that whatever Edward Said's own authorial intentions may have been, the dominant reception of his most famous book, Orientalism in Middle East Studies, contributed for a very long time to a kind of relative marginalization of race as a category in favor of other field-specific terms in analytics. In this respect, the choice of language in naming this series strikes me as a signal for how a very different historical present has been refracted into the wave of new scholarship that you're all discussing over these weeks. And my own sense is that this recent considered embrace of race as an analytical category is opening up a whole range of really exciting new possibilities for resituating histories of the Middle East in relation to other parts of the world, and just for asking kinds of questions that I think were foreclosed in various ways by the languages that used to be employed to consider many of the same dynamics. Okay, so my understanding is that many of you have actually read some or all of the book, and that our conversation can proceed in the style of a seminar. but as someone who has been keenly following this series online, I'm also aware and very glad that the meetings are going to have a kind of second life on the web. So I wanted to use these opening remarks also to offer a kind of overview of the book for viewers at home in the future. And since it's been out for a while now, I've noticed that many readers and reviewers have tended to focus on the parts of the book that describe Egypt's emergence in the late 19th century as a sort of imperial laboratory for new kinds of financial investment and speculation. I suspect that we will spend quite a bit of time talking about those portions of the research this evening. So right now, I'd like to take this opportunity to emphasize a different through line in the book, namely the history of anti-colonial politics that lives mainly inside the even-numbered chapters. And again, for the sake of doing things a bit differently, I'm going to do so by offering a brief sketch of 4 key characters that appear in those chapters: Mohammed Rushdie, Ahmed Helmi, Abdulaziz Jawish, and Abdurrahman Rafi'i. The latter 2 probably better known than the former 2. And because each of these figures was similarly committed to challenging the British occupation in both thought and practice, we can chart a kind of historical trajectory of Egypt's anti-colonial movement through their work. But in order to do so, we need to understand what exactly they thought they were opposing and what sorts of problems they sought to address and solve. So I'm going to start with some quick remarks about the book's arguments, both about the distinguishing features of colonial economism as a historically specific form of racism, and about the political economic transformations that discourse helped to unleash. Okay, so in the simplest sense, Egypt's occupation is a book about the 4 decades of British rule in Egypt that followed the military invasion of 1882 to quash the popular movement for constitutional rule and fiscal sovereignty that is commonly known as the Arabi Revolt. From its earliest moments, the ensuing British occupation was informed by and organized around the discourse that I refer to as colonial economism. Given its importance to much of what we're likely to discuss, I'd like to say 3 things right away about the choice of terminology. So first, as the word is employed today, economism usually refers to a methodological problem, a decision to accord some kind of causal primacy to economic forces rather than other possible factors in the analysis and explanation of this or that social phenomenon. I'm suggesting instead that we can and should treat economism as a way of apprehending the world, particular to the history of capitalism itself. In other words, as a problem that already exists within various social formations, rather than only in the minds of scholars making claims about them. In the case of Egypt, this means that economistic ideas both informed the specific policies British officials adopted and saturated their statements about the effects of their so-called reforms. Second, to the extent that historians and social theorists have tried to explain, rather than simply correct or denounce economism, they've usually done so by way of ideological or political affiliation. In plainer terms, economism is usually invoked as one of the unique crimes of Marxist thought. The key point here, at least for now, is that this remarkably durable association has made it much too easy to ignore or dismiss forms of economism that circulate well beyond the confines of the political left. The colonial officials I write about in this book were not reading Marx, and they would have hated what he had to say if they had been. They nevertheless made claims about the power of economic determination that could put the most dogmatic of Stalinists to shame. And in fact, I first started thinking about this book as a history of economism when I noticed that they too sometimes used base superstructure metaphors to explain their ideas about the economic determination of the political. But crucially, when they did so, they also insisted that some populations of people were more susceptible to the play of economic forces than others. In other words, their version of economic determination was not about an aspiration to a universal social science, however crude it may have been. On the contrary, it was a way of making claims about racial difference. With remarkable consistency, British officials proposed that most Egyptians, as racially distinctive human subjects, were capable of no more and no less than a bare recognition of their own basic material interests. On the one hand, their responsiveness to economic gain and loss meant that they could and should be more actively integrated into the transactions of modern commercial society, and that they would judge British rule by the economic growth it could deliver. On the other, what Egyptians purportedly lacked was the wherewithal to reason beyond the calculus of individual profit and loss. And it was only that comprehension of a wider public good that qualified some populations to govern themselves and others. Put differently, in a country like Egypt, the core principles of liberal political economy could, under the right sort of government, hold true, but liberal political theory could not. The third and final point to bear in mind here has to do with the remarkable consistency I just mentioned. There's been a certain trend over the last couple decades of Anglophone scholarship to challenge the confident self-descriptions of colonial regimes by locating diversity, disagreement, and uncertainty in the archives. Whatever else may be said of this approach, for my purposes, it has a tendency to distract from something fundamental about how British rule was actually experienced by Egyptians themselves at the time. Disagreements certainly existed behind closed doors and in private correspondence, but Lord Cromer in particular was famously obsessive about the degree of control he exercised over the occupation's public statements. And it was the consistency of the statements British officials made about them that Egyptian critics of the occupation perceived as threatening and in turn sought to rebut. Ideas about the responsiveness of Egyptians to their immediate material interests figured prominently in the published reports with which Cromer and his staff sought to justify their role in the country to publics in both Egypt and Great Britain. But the discourse of colonial economism did not simply serve as a gloss on some other hidden imperial logics. Rather, it informed and shaped the sorts of policies that the occupation pursued. And here I suspect that many of you who were here last week will recognize a kind of resonance between what I'm arguing and some of what Miriam Davis is doing in her recent book. Notions about the innate potential of Egypt's smallholding peasants as productive economic subjects figured centrally in British plans for the country's economic recovery. The occupation's early efforts to augment and regulate supplies of irrigation water, to diminish the government's reliance on conscript labor, and to standardize landed property were all premised on the notion that peasants would recognize and seize upon their own interests, most of all by growing more cotton. But that claim about a narrow responsiveness to material interests also stamped the other side of the coin, so to speak. Beginning in the 1890s, as their position in the country grew more secure, the British moved to shut down existing avenues of political participation for which they deemed Egypt's peasantry utterly unqualified. Following the appointment of a new British advisor to the Ministry of the Interior in 1895, one of his first acts in control of the provincial administration was to abolish the system of village elections through which the rural populace had once exercised at least a nominal say over the appointment of local officials. Significant as these changes to the organization of the Egyptian state would prove for future generations, the most dramatic and distinctive implications of colonial economism, however, took the form of a series of experiments with agricultural credit that also began in the mid-1890s. For decades now, Egypt has figured as an exemplary case of peripheralization within the geographies of global capitalism. On this understanding, British rule simply reinforced the country's existing role as a vast cotton plantation supplying cheap raw materials to European industries. All but obscured in such accounts is Egypt's emergence as a key target and laboratory for investment and experimentation in the worldwide expansion of metropolitan financial networks around the turn of the last century. So this is the book's second major argument. That a de facto colonial territory like Egypt became a major site for European investment in the late 19th century is not at all surprising. But that such investment assumed the form of banks making loans directly to colonial subjects, and particularly to peasant smallholders, was. One of the occupation's most contentious propositions was the notion that even humble Egyptian smallholders could, under the right circumstances, employ mortgage credit as farm capital. At a moment when a rising cohort of conservative administrators was elsewhere arguing that colonial populations should be insulated from the vagaries of the world market, Lord Cromer's regime in Egypt advanced a series of policies aimed at extending the reach of European financial networks into the countryside. Though they claimed that the ensuing wave of mortgage finance would redound to the benefit of Egypt's hardworking peasantry, the lending practices of these new financial institutions in fact served to amplify existing patterns of social and geographic inequality. But at the same time, the massive influx of foreign capital in the decade between 1897 and 1907 did contribute to a rapid and dramatic surge in land prices and asset values. As the occupation's boosters marveled at the country's newfound wealth, the British claimed that their experimental program of economic development was succeeding. It was this potential correspondence between an official discourse that treated economic growth as functional to public approval on the one hand, and the complex of social transformations that British policy appeared to have set in motion on the other, that troubled the occupation's Egyptian critics. Consequently, despite otherwise very significant shifts in the objectives, strategies, and social constituencies of an anti-colonial movement in formation, articulating a stable and compelling critique of colonial economism remained a central concern of its leading thinkers. So to get into the details a bit more, I'm now going to offer these 4 short biographies. So first, Mohammad Rushdie became a spy for the young Khedive Abbas Helmi II sometime around the summer of 1894. Before joining the network of informants managed by the palace spymaster Mohammad Saeed Shimi Bey, he had spent several years working as the manager of a large cotton plantation in Sharqiya province to the east of the Nile Delta. That experience equipped Mohammad Rushdie to offer a detailed assessment of the transformations that a dozen years of British rule had wrought, and what he saw enraged him. In an extraordinary letter he penned to Shimi Bey in November of 1894, he produced the outlines of an analysis that anticipated, by more than half a century, the general contours of what we would now describe as a dependency theory account of colonial underdevelopment. The British, he observed, had used the debacle of Egypt's debt default in the 1870s to force the conversion of more and more Egyptian farmland to cotton cultivation. Not only had the country's growing reliance on the export of a single crop undermined other forms of economic activity, but the fluctuations in global cotton prices had rendered the livelihoods of Egypt's poorest farmers all the more precarious. Saddled with debts and taxes they couldn't pay, many would be forced to sell their farms to the wealthy landlords and foreign companies that stood always at the ready to monopolize the country's wealth. In referring to the British sarcastically throughout such accounts simply as el-Muslihin, the reformers, Mohammad Rushdie marked out the distance between an official discourse of economic improvement and the realities he observed on the ground. But even as he contested the narrative of reform on its own terms, the itinerant spy also questioned the validity of those terms themselves as criteria for good government. In a striking reflection on the economistic character of the occupation, he mused, quote, "The pound has become the religion, the trust, and the support upon which people rely, and every person now strives to earn a bunch of pounds so that he may leave the country with them, or so that he may make a living from them by keeping money out of the hands of his countrymen." From this vantage, far from an innate defect of Egyptian character, the materialism the British liked to describe was a symptomatic effect of their own policies. In mobilizing to narrate in minute and often lurid detail the misdeeds of the willing enablers the British had appointed to do their bidding, Mohammad Rushdie and his fellow spies thus sought to convince the young Khedive that the occupation was eroding the pillars of good government that his own forebears had spent decades building. Now, to the extent that the formation of this palace spy network represented a key moment of origin in an organized opposition to British rule, in the 1890s it was still largely a retrospective movement, driven by a group of seasoned bureaucrats and functionaries who had devoted their lives to the project of Khedivial state building. A decade later, a witty young journalist named Ahmed Helmi coined a pithy moniker for the tendency of British officials to, quote, point toward the rapid progress of this country in its material life every time the sun comes up or a new year begins. Gilded speech, he called it. Where Mohammad Rushdie had still been able to dismiss the occupation's reformist claims as mere falsehood, Ahmed Helmi perceived a new danger in the barrage of official statements alloyed with references to Egypt's newfound wealth. As foreign investment poured into the country and land prices soared amidst the financial boom of the early 1900s, the British could and did insist with much greater confidence that their own chosen measures of economic improvement stood as reliable proxies for popular approval. As co-editor of El Liwa, by then the leading organ of opposition to British rule, Helmi devoted his energies to refuting such claims on as many fronts as possible. At the height of the boom, the paper's detailed reporting on economic affairs offered a rigorous critical analysis of the ephemeral, uneven, and increasingly speculative character of the new financial wealth the British adduced as evidence of their own success. And Helmi's own columns often dwelt on the glaring disjuncture between the apparent availability of such wealth and the very limited forms of social improvement on which the occupation was willing to spend it. But Ahmed Helmi also bore responsibility for at least two developments that would have dramatic implications for the trajectory of anti-colonial politics, and that should, I suggest, be read as elements of a practical critique of colonial economism. First, more than any other single figure, it was Ahmed Helmi who made the famous Dinshoway incident of 1906, now widely regarded as the key turning point in the rise of Egyptian nationalism, into a major event in public consciousness. When word of the altercation between a hunting party of British soldiers and the peasant villagers of Dinshoway first reached Cairo, Helmi immediately boarded a train for the Nile Delta and published a series of investigative reports about what had transpired. And when, 2 weeks later, the special tribunal convened by the British convicted the villagers of a premeditated attack, he returned to Dinshoway to witness firsthand the execution and flogging of the peasants in full view of their own families. And I should just say, in doing this research, I started collecting accounts of people's experiences of reading this later reporting, and I think they need to be understood as historically akin to something like the experience of watching the George Floyd video. I mean, there are numerous accounts of how people's sort of nationalist politics emerged in and through the experience of reading about the execution of these villagers. So what Helmy perceived and made clear in his disturbingly gory reporting of the ordeal was the stark contrast between the occupation's claims about the legitimating effects of economic growth and the actual role of colonial violence that had been revealed at Dinh Xueh. And having grasped with great acuity the stakes of a mounting struggle over competing means for representing public opinion, Helmy soon pioneered a set of tactics that would thereafter become standard practice for the nationalist movement. In the aftermath of the Dinh Xueh executions, he organized both the circulation of printed petitions for signatures and a kind of telegraphic spamming whereby agents of the National Party would send identical messages at the same time from all around the country. And this was a way of kind of rendering visible distributions of popular opinion that the occupation's tables on cotton exports and land prices had obscured. Now, while figures like Ahmed Helmy were concerned with refuting colonial economism at the moment of its greatest potential resonance, many of them also predicted that that moment would soon end. As it spread and intensified from a crash in stock prices on the markets of Alexandria and Cairo to a wave of mortgage defaults afflicting tens of thousands of Egyptian smallholders, the financial crisis of 1907 furnished the opponents of British rule with powerful new arguments that the occupation was failing by its own economistic standards. When the new consul general, Eldon Gorst, declined to take any concerted action to avert the catastrophic constriction of credit, his critics began to argue more forcefully that only a government run by Egyptians themselves would employ the institutions of the modern state to serve Egyptian rather than foreign interests. But even as the language of crisis furnished a new idiom for mobilizing such straightforward claims to political sovereignty, the profound upheaval of 1907 and its aftermath revealed entanglements between the economic and the political that would thereafter lend the project of Egyptian nationalism its profoundly contradictory character. So in these last few minutes of my remarks, I'll touch on at least some of those contradictions by way of two more biographical sketches. To be perfectly clear, I do not argue in the book, nor am I suggesting here, that the economic hardship following 1907 simply fueled popular discontent and thereby drove Egypt's laboring masses into the arms of the nationalist movement. That reading of events, which does appear in some studies of the period, runs a very strong risk of reproducing the occupation's own claims that most Egyptians could do little more than react to economic circumstances. The country's laboring classes already had plenty of reasons to resent and resist British rule, and notably, even before 1907, growing numbers of workers had started to employ the methods of labor militancy, not just to exact basic material gains, but to demand a role in the institutions that govern their own conditions of life and work. And this is partly about what the article that's coming out maybe tomorrow is about. What the crisis helped to open up was a kind of rapprochement from two directions. So for Egypt's laboring classes, the recognizably novel and peculiarly generalized character of the financial crisis made it all the more plausible to identify the ensuing dislocation specifically with the effects of British rule. And for the leadership of the country's major nationalist organizations, who had once been profoundly reticent about involving Egypt's poorer classes in their cause, this was the moment of a decisive turn toward mass mobilization. In the wake of the crisis, critical analyses of foreign finance as a mechanism of class exploitation on an international scale made it all the more plausible to see forms of class struggle at other scales as part and parcel of a multifaceted project to challenge imperial rule. It was this radicalizing impulse that the itinerant journalist, educator, and activist Abdelaziz Jawish sought to pursue as the Egyptian National Party's most dynamic strategist at the time. The extraordinary multiplication of unions, political associations, and popular educational institutions that occurred with support from El-Hezb al-Watani between 1907 and 1910 was a testament to the broad appeal of a political project that now linked national independence to egalitarian practices of self-rule wherever they might occur. Even as the diverse manifestations of crisis thus helped to transform Egyptian nationalism into a genuinely popular movement, however, those same phenomena raise questions about the very preconditions of national independence itself. Nationalist critics might now attribute the tangling of credit relations, the acceleration of land transactions, or the spread of financial speculation to specific policies the British had imposed. But those policies drew Egypt into a set of dependencies that had long since exceeded the particular institutions, colonial or otherwise, that first set them in motion. So long as large segments of the Egyptian public depended on regular flows of foreign capital to sustain their everyday lives, the independence they demanded could no longer be construed in narrowly political terms. Understood in this way, the central concern in these years of what is often labeled economic nationalism was not with industrialization or a lack thereof, but with human freedom. Where generations of scholarship on nationalism since Benedict Anderson have insisted on its political and intellectual emptiness, figures like the young lawyer Abdurrahman Rafi'i, who would subsequently become the most important historian of the nationalist movement, sought to position their conception of Egyptian nationalism as a viable alternative to the major ideological currents of their times. In so doing, they arrived at a rigorous critique of economism, albeit by other names, as a historical problem conditioned by discrete forms of social practice. If Egyptians seemed to behave more and more like the grasping, self-interested individuals that the British had long alleged them to be, these figures argued, it was not by virtue of racial defect or civilizational backwardness, but because they inhabited a society that made it increasingly difficult and perilous to do otherwise. But in identifying the origins and perpetuation of such conditions with the malign effects of colonial rule, they most often pursued their own insights toward an indictment not of capital in general, but of foreign capital. The upshot was a persistent, almost willful confidence in the power of national capital and national institutions to resolve the devastating contradictions they themselves so forcefully denounced in their own situation. As I narrate its trajectory in the closing chapters of the book, then, the nationalist movement in the early decades of the 20th century was riven by these profound contradictions. The account of financial boom and bust that the book's central chapters provide helps, I hope, to explain how the capital-labor relation emerged as one of the dominant idioms for understanding the country's colonial condition, and how in turn the nationalist movement became the primary historical vector for the emergence of mass politics. But that same process and the entanglements of the political and economic subordination it bequeathed also generated the conditions for a managerial developmentalist project in which the needs, aspirations, and interests of discrete classes and social groups would be subordinated to the collective imperative of national capital formation. And it was these conflicting tendencies that would continue to cast a shadow over Egyptian politics for decades to come. So I suspect we may want to talk about sort of where that points, but I will stop there and turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So now we're going to have a response from one of our former MA students here, Mehmet Emir. And then shortly after that, we're going to be having not a question and answer session, but a question and comment session from the audience where we're going to be quote unquote gagging our speaker for 20 minutes. So please prepare your thoughts, your comments, your questions. But before that, Emir, would you like to share some of your reflections?
First, I'd like to thank the collective for having me and Professor for coming and joining us. I wanted to offer also a quick overview of what I got from the book as well. I really appreciated the work. And you start by discussing the first decade of the occupation and setting forward that the essential British assumption that the rural power structures and the power structures and the notables yielded economic dysfunction that led to the bankruptcy in Egypt, and hence they justified the occupation through that. And these structures and notables themselves became the targets of the occupation. And here a question that came to my mind is how much Lord Cromer is really focused on economism, and or is he more interested in the material per se? And then you go on and talk about 1894 and how the Ministry of Internal Affairs were taken over by the occupation. And it was in order to fill in the gap that was created by the incapable Egyptian political mind. And this led to the village and grassroots politics being dismissed, and how local officials became the very tools of the occupation itself. But local politics did continue, and the Khedive's dynasty and the spies and the locals were rather unhappy with the loss of morals and the way they were preserving their rural culture, regardless of the economic output. And then you go on and talk about the British idea that the locals are economically driven, and they would not really engage in the political life as long as their material needs are satisfied. Hence, that's why the European investors start pouring into Egypt. And here there's a central claim that Egypt was a major investment ground. And I'm wondering if this is really the case, looking at America or other parts of the world. Is Egypt really a major investment ground for European investors? But regardless of that, this led to an artificial or maybe superficial economic boom, and which consequently increased the peasant inequality and distance it from the profits of the investors and what's going on the ground. Of course, this was against the justification that the British first came to occupy Egypt, and they thought that the provision of the necessary economic platform would flourish rural life. Here, I'm wondering about who the justification is directed at. Is when we say public, do you reckon it's the European public, or if it's the peasants in Egypt, or maybe it's the investors themselves? And I think it's important, like that's quite important for us to understand the distinction between what private and public interests are and what private and state capital really mean. And around this chapter of the book, I started to think, because there's a great deal of what economism is and a lot of insight on that, but I started to lose what political means and what the borders of political really are. And I think that's a question that came to my mind during this chapter. And thereon you go and talk about the nationalist Arab press and how they formed an opposition against the occupation. And Ahmed Hilmi, like you said, became quite the figure. And as the Brits are focused on the economic boom, that's what they start attacking, and they form against this economic boom, and they say that it's superficial, and also that the occupation cannot be reduced to just material monetary gains. And then 1907 hits, right? And then the self-legitimizing occupation takes a blow, and their argument is not as stable as it was before. And you say that the opposition, the local opposition, took this and ran, and a nationalist discourse emerged, arguing against the deep connection between the Egyptian existence and the rather fragile world markets, and how the strikes and unions emerged. And I thought it was very interesting how you linked it to the larger frame and the Young Turks and different developments in the Middle East. And after that, you go on and talk about the Dinshaway incident and how the British investors were supposed to be backed by the occupation itself, and so now the occupation has this problem, as well as the warm problem due to the monoculture of cotton. It would be quite interesting to hear if you have anything else to say about the environmental history of Egypt beyond the monoculture and the warms. And yeah, so thereon there's a shift from the fellows or the peasants being a partner as Homo economicus to now the occupation has turned against them, and now they're taking the blame. And this leads to an increase in regulatory coercion in order to maintain agrarian capitalism, which further deepened the rural inequality, as you say. And after that, you look at Egyptian nationalists and how they didn't only want to get rid of the occupiers and replace authorities with Egyptians, but they wanted to get rid of the institutions of the occupation in order to build a national capital. I thought this was very interesting, and this really meant that the Egyptians had to restructure the political economic subjectivities and the relationship. But you say that they failed to go against capitalism itself. And this is like a multi-layered occupation. I think it's a very interesting insight. And overall, the book is quite unique and very interesting arguments, and the empirical research in it, especially on land tenures and credit systems, is very impressive. And usually, Egypt is a rather well-researched place, but the political, social, and cultural grounds that led to the areas of colonialism or nationalism is well researched, but you bring in the economic side of it, and it goes beyond just Middle East and Egypt. If you're interested in colonialism, economic history, political thought, capitalism, intellectual history, your book is touches upon all of these things. So I did ask some questions throughout, but rather larger questions I have is I'm wondering, how does colonial economism shed light on the post-colonial Egypt? Do you reckon that's why economic development is really the central claim on which international organizations or local leaders build their basis on? And also, if colonial economism sheds light onto financial crisis in 20th century. So that's looking forward, and on the other side of this, going back, obviously British involvement in Egypt precedes 1882, and earlier decades of relations, did they influence what you call colonial economism or this whole experiment? And more specifically, does the pre-1882 credit debt formations have continuity into what you're talking about? And another question is I'm wondering if you can expand on the relationship between intellectual formations and capitalism or political economy itself. In the world, it would be interesting to hear what you have to say, but also in Egypt, I'm wondering why the intellectual formations led to nationalism, why, and not anything else. Why not socialism or anything like that? Or outside the Egyptian intellectuals also, I'm wondering, how did the peasants think? Obviously, the bankruptcy hit them hard, but it would be a rather difficult insight to gain. But I wonder what kind of challenges it would be in obtaining that knowledge. And also, I'm wondering if colonial, and because this is an occupation, what's going on in Egypt, right? It's not a colonial integration. So, for example, while, as we said, French and Algeria is trying to turn the Homo Islamicus into Homo economicus, the categories in Egypt that you're interested in is economicus, Homo economicus, and Homo politicus. So I'm wondering, rather than these categories itself, just the act of categorizing, does that, like the bifurcation and the categorization, persist in both? So if you try to pull behind this, does the act of categorizing itself make occupation and colonialism the same? Is there really a distinction between the two? And lastly, I would like to ask what the purpose of the experiment itself is, because obviously after the Indian uprising, there's a shift in the general nature of what colonialism is. But do you reckon this experiment is for Egypt itself and the time frame you're looking at, 1880s to until the World War? Because in sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia, their claims are rather that they're not Homo economicus or politicus. They just cannot do either. So I'm wondering if this experiment in the first place is just dedicated on Egypt for this time period. Thank you.
Thanks, Samir. That was great. Maybe, do you want to pick maybe a few of those, a couple of those questions to answer before we open it up?
Yeah. Let me just organize my thoughts for a second. So, there's a kind of cluster of questions about like the specificity of Egypt as a peculiar case of colonial rule and how colonial economism relates to that, and how several things. Starting with your last question, which I understood also to be a kind of a question about how to relate the story that this book is telling to the story that Miriam is telling in her book, where I think we have similar understandings about the importance of making sense of how racialized discourses about colonial subjects get engineered into the actual practices through which capital accumulation proceeds, but the populations in question are racialized differently. One of the things that I was trying to work through, particularly in the beginning of the book, and I guess in the seventh chapter, which marks this kind of shift to a much more pessimistic, recognizably conservative outlook toward Egyptians as colonial subjects under occupation, is the way that racial thought in this period actually became a commonplace way for, at least for certain populations of thinkers, to make sense of how their dominant ways of explaining and understanding the world were not borne out by the theories that they had, right? So in a sense, the kind of lineage of liberal thought up to John Stuart Mill and Cromer that the introduction is laying out is sort of charting the way, eventually, a set of problems that continued to recur in liberal thought about kind of how to relate the emergence of what was understood to be a relatively self-contained economic domain governed by knowable laws that the discourse of political economy could explain, to a domain of political practice that many of those same thinkers were interested in. And in many instances, basically the way of kind of squaring that complex relation was by recourse to claims about sort of taxonomies of difference, and that ends up being basically what we see happening at the moment when all of these claims that are made about what British reform is supposed to do in Egypt start to break down by the end of the first decade of the 20th century. That basically the claim is like the theories aren't wrong, and it's not that there's something about the patterns of investment that can explain why the outcomes are totally different than what they were predicting. It's actually that the population of people upon whom those policies have been imposed are different than they had expected them to be. And that way of, I mean, this is also an answer to your question about sort of Egypt's significance and what the experiment is about. That was a live debate in the world of empire around the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, in a way that a lot of other people were paying very close attention to. So when the United States occupied the Philippines at the end of the 19th century and started to kind of learn how to do empire, members of the Roosevelt administration became obsessed with Egypt as a potential model for how they were going to govern the Philippines. And you start to see, they actually sent people to Egypt to study what the British were doing and tried to replicate many of these policies there. And the discussions about whether or not they would work all turned on questions about whether Filipino colonial subjects were the same as or different from Egyptians, and whether they were industrious in the same way or not. And so I think this is also a way of, in setting up the introduction to her book, Miriam makes a set of very interesting kind of general claims about the way Islam was racialized. But I think that we can understand the moment that she is looking at in Algeria as one in which the kind of particular coordinates of racialization looked different than they did in Egypt. Let me just return to your list of questions and slice through one more if I can. The question about intellectual formation and what did peasants think? I mean, right, this is basically like the holy grail of social history. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. I actually spent the largest amount of time in the archives reading peasant petitions, which are not, a clear window into the brains of peasant subjects either. They had to be written usually by the local ardakhalgi, the person that would write the petitions for them. So there's significant mediation there. But they do provide an interesting index of the kinds of problems that they were experiencing, the language that they were using to describe the social world that they inhabited, and so part of my interest in all of this stuff about the reconstitution of village institutions had to do with the fact that in the 1890s and the early 1900s, overwhelmingly, the kind of experience of British rule that was being described there was basically about the evisceration of a set of mechanisms that had provided some possibility for recourse against forms of power abuse that were kind of widespread, and I think for many of these people just assumed to be features of everyday life. But in kind of describing all of these abuses that they were happening, they were kind of mapping out a set of shifts in the terrain on which they could possibly kind of push back against those forms of abuse. And so that was overwhelmingly the focus of the collections of petitions that I was finding sort of in the earlier part of the period that the book covers. And by the 19-teens, you start to find many more commentaries about the kind of volatility of commodity markets and other kinds of price fluctuations, and new conceptions of the state as an apparatus that at least has the potential to be intervening in people's everyday lives to kind of protect them from these kinds of volatility. And I have a colleague, Samantha Iyer, who was in the archives with me at the same time, who is writing what I think is probably the most ambitiously and truly global history that I know of, that is a kind of long history of U.S. food aid policies in Egypt and India. And the early parts of the project basically trace the historical conditions of possibility for these relationships through kind of simultaneous movements of agrarian pressure on states in the United States, in Egypt, and in India, all around the end of the 19th century, where, subjected to similar kinds of social conditions, you have agrarian populations starting to make new kinds of demands about the forms of intervention that the state might undertake. And I'll just end by using this as a way of answering your question about like how important is Egypt really in this story. So absolutely, I am not claiming, and I tried to be clear about this in the book, that in like absolute terms of quantities of capital invested, Egypt is a bit player relative to the United States. So if one is studying the kind of financial expansion of the late 19th century, the main story is massive capital transfers to the United States that basically pave the way toward a kind of, in Giovanni Arrighi terms, a kind of shift in world hegemony. But qualitatively, for a whole variety of reasons, Egypt and the United States ended up being sites of similar kinds of speculation and experimentation in ways that meant that they experienced very similar kinds of crises at exactly the same time. And those transformations, in interesting ways, resulted in kind of similar sorts of political demands. So because of the likeliest readership of the book, I did not emphasize this in quite this way in the way that the 5th chapter was written. But one of the kind of covert intentions of that chapter was basically to point out that from the vantage of the British Empire, like one can actually think about Egypt and the United States in kind of parallel comparative terms in a way that would be utterly anathema to a kind of mainstream Americanist in the United States. And so this was also a way of kind of suggesting that the field of history of capitalism study, or histories of capitalism in the US, which is overwhelmingly dominated by Americanists, needs to kind of open itself to learning a little bit more about other parts of the world.
Okay, wonderful. So Aaron, I think now we're going to gag you officially,
gag away.
And open up to the floor. So, Mira, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, for a great presentation, and Amir for great questions. So my question is actually inspired by your comments, Amir, and it's about the relationship between Miriam's book and this book, and the interesting divergence between the racialization of the peasant in Algeria and Egypt, because you're right, they're kind of going in opposite directions, right? In Algeria, Homo economicus is different from Homo Islamicus, whereas in your book, the Egyptian peasant is Homo economicus effectively, right? So how do we think about and explain that difference? And I was wondering whether there's something in what you were saying, Amir, about the different kinds of colonialism that are going on here. So obviously in Algeria, you've got a settler colonial project, and in here you've got more of a protectorate. And so the object, the capitalist object of interest is actually different, right? So in the Algerian case, it's land, and here it's the peasant as a sort of expropriatable subject, right? And so what we're seeing here is a flex in the character of racial capitalism, which is dependent on the object of the administration, right? So in Egypt, it's speculative profit, and in Algeria, it's land and commodity kind of creation. And I just, that's a very crude reading in a way of both books, but I just wondered whether that was a useful way to kind of think about that.
Yeah, so actually, and we were talking about this in class, and we were wondering whether it would be fair to say that Miriam is thinking about Homo economicus as a sort of prescriptive project, so shifting from Homo Islamicus to Homo economicus, whereas this is a sort of descriptive account of Homo economicus that we get in your book, except that it didn't seem contradictory, because what you're talking about is actually constricted to a 30-year period, right? And then there's a shift towards a more conservative kind of colonial governmentality inspired by Maine. Anybody else want to come in on this? Bayan?
Oh, do I take the mic or I can speak?
Just speak very loudly.
Okay, I think you guys can. Yeah, thank you, Amit and Aaron, for this talk. So, Aaron, I was just wondering, were there any, I mean, you can make the argument that, a primary homo economics, I'm sorry, I don't know the term, person was the Egyptian woman, just because of the fact that, the Fallahi, like, as the producer of the Egyptian Fallah, and as the Egyptian population more generally. So I was wondering if there were any particular feminist critiques of colonial economism, you know what I mean, and the way that women fit into that. And I'm wondering, within sort of non-nationalist critiques, such as feminist ones, like, were there sort of alternatives to the economy as a sort of British invented sphere that the Egyptians had to take over? Like, was there an element of world making that came into play in sort of relating to the economy, or as in creating alternatives to it? But yeah, that's it.
Ala?
Yeah, I had a question about.
Louder.
I had a question about violence in your and how it fits in your book, because you said Deng Shui is sort of a foundational moment for Egyptian nationalism, and there's a whole museum dedicated to it, so no one will argue against that. But the occupation itself was founded in violence. So did it take Egyptians 25 years to figure out the intertwining of violence and economism? And maybe you could say something about how British discourse maybe suppressed that, maybe played around it. I want to hear your thoughts more about violence.
Gabriel?
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Amir, for the questions as well. I have two questions for Aaron. Well, the first is really more of a question. The second is also maybe open for everyone. But the first is about the transformation of the dissertation to the book, and what you felt was the biggest turn that you made when you were adapting it for a book. I mean, I had the fortune of reading parts of the dissertation and talking with you about it at the time as you were adapting it. And it seemed like the critique of liberalism was more foregrounded in the book version. And I'm just wondering what was going on with you as you moved into a discussion of that tradition. And then the second question I have is, I have always thought about this book as coming out of, and I think you made it very clear on other occasions that it came out of the 2008 financial crisis, in part to understand the politics that come with all of us being dependent on these very volatile movements of abstract speculative investment. And so I wonder, and that I think inspired a lot of the history, new histories of capitalism, so histories of finance capital, and I think we're now living in an interesting time. That this organization or group or collective phenomenal world keeps on using this term, the revenge of the real, so that we're now living in an age where we're not so obviously finance is still hugely important, but we are now all talking about food prices and access to food and obviously like the looming, and the COVID played a part in this, and the looming climate catastrophe plays a part in this. And I just wonder what you and others also would sort of see as being kind of animus for histories of capitalism in this kind of moment, which is very different from a post-2008 moment. And I almost wonder, sometimes I feel like we are, or at least I certainly find myself reproducing a kind of economism, because I'm just like, if we can just get, interest rates right, or like, if only we can get capitalism to operate the way it should, then we can, restore access to food, which is obviously really, delusional. So yeah, that's kind of a question for you and for everyone else as well.
Rafi?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you very much, Amir. I thought the questions were excellent. My question is a little bit in the other direction about race, because I really appreciate the comments you made that for a long time in Middle East studies, we didn't really talk about race, or it was talked about in other terms. And I like the way you framed what Miriam is doing in her book around the coordinates of racialization. On the other hand, what I've seen a lot of recently is people just plopping the word racial capitalism onto anything without like a deep grounded way of saying how it's actually working in our regional context. Now, Cedric Robinson was writing a very particular book. He's historicizing something very particularly, some of which I love, some of which I disagree with. So I'm wondering, in your case, what are the coordinates of racialization and race that you're particularly speaking about? I think the contours of economism are kind of clear, but I just wanted to push you on the question of race and racialization, and what is the book telling us about that?
Matthew?
I just was wondering if you could say a bit, maybe for people who don't know much about the history of Egypt, what is there something particular about what's happening before the British arrive that means that colonial economism is more seen as more relevant? So maybe thinking about the cotton economy, but also the turn towards disciplining peasants from such an early period. Is that conducive to seeing the peasants in Egypt as Homo economicus?
I'm holding the silence in case you're done.
I got two questions. The first is about the chapter 8, where you mentioned the Coptic Congress, when they want to sign a series of demands to the Egyptian national part, and this kind of demands was declined because they saw that the economic problem within the Coptic case was actually a result of the colonial condition. So that means that now the idea for the Egyptian nationalists is trying to create a single unified Egyptian national economy, but despite the difference between maybe different ethnicities, so for them, they thought the Egyptian nationalists thought they could represent the Egypt, the nation, but not this kind of Coptic people. And also, when you are referring to the category of economic nationalism in the intellectual thinking of these Egyptian nationalists, you also mentioned that actually this kind of forms the so-called cooperation these Egyptian nationalists wanted to promote, the communal landing, co-ownership, and cooperative labor was actually preserved or actually exists in the village life in Egypt. But that was this kind of voice was neglected by these Egyptian nationalists. So you're trying to argue that within their agenda of a new independent Egypt national economy, the inequality, the hierarchies was still preserved. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more about this kind of two things, the inequality between different kind of people, ethnicities, minority population, and also the inequality between the social hierarchies. upon this national economy development project? Yes.
Final Reem?
Yeah, final question. Thanks so much, Aaron.
Hi.
And thank you, Amir. Okay, I'll ask my second question first, since we haven't seen each other since our masters, which we did together, so it's a pleasure to see you again here. And as I can see some of our master's students with us, I wanted to ask you if you had any kind of words of advice or thoughts about your journey since then to now, like just a separate kind of question. I think it would be great to hear from you and inspiring. And the other question I had was kind of a repeat of Amir's question about the post-colonial and whether you've tracked forward some of these kinds of arguments that you found in the press. Possibly unfair to ask you that, you've already done great work already, but I'm just curious, your thoughts on kind of post-52, what gets taken up, if any. And thank you so much.
Okay, well, I noticed no one's really pushed back against colonial economism, so I think we're going to wait for the next round for that. So perhaps maybe pick a few questions that, or maybe lump some of them together and offer some of your thoughts, and then we'll have a second round of comments and questions.
Okay. Right. Let me just. So let me start with Reem's question, because I think it may also be a way of answering part of Gabe's question about now, and it's also like this is the first time I've gotten to do research in an archive in 4 years because of the pandemic. So I spent today is Thursday. I spent Tuesday in the archives of the Bank of England doing some work that is mostly related to this Suez Canal project, and so I guess the first thing to say that I've been thinking more about since the book has to do with the emergence of this category of national wealth that starts to appear already in the thought of somebody like Talat Harb by the early 19-teens. And I started to notice it more I've been looking in considerable depth at this struggle that erupted around a proposal to extend the Suez Canal concession by another 40 years in 1909. And it was in that moment that both that the canal kind of became a major object of nationalist aspirations through which ideas about self-government and ideas about political independence were kind of tethered to notions about reclaiming the canal. And one of the things that started to happen in proposals about what would happen if Egypt actually reclaimed the canal rather than allowing the company to continue exploiting it was the kind of beginning of some musings about the possibility, both that like the canal was a form of national property constituted by the peasant labor conscripted through corvée, and that as a result, the revenues generated by it were a form of national wealth. And that argument has some of the kind of early lineaments of what later starts to be known as Arab socialism, which is not exactly socialism, but is premised on an idea that there are forms of public wealth that can be mobilized in service of a project of national capital formation such that the line between public monies and the private wealth of companies starts to get blurry in service of kind of collective enrichment. And those arguments, as they were, first being articulated in the early 1900s, are really interesting because they were premised on, I think, quite a perceptive critique of the ways in which colonial officials in Egypt and elsewhere had, on the one hand, kind of ideologically insisted on a hard line between private wealth and public monies, right? So the claim is that Oriental despotism is in fact kind of characterized by a muddying of these lines. This is why the Egyptian state has gone bankrupt. This is very bad. But they have started to recognize that this is actually how colonial states operate everywhere, that they commingle public monies extracted from colonial populations in service of capital enterprises originating elsewhere. And so already in the early 1900s, there are the beginnings of an idea that those same strategies could be kind of retooled in service of a project of national economic development. I'm in the very early stages of doing this, but I think that there are good reasons for kind of following those arguments forward. And they also, I think, might begin to provide a very different account of the significance of state rents to states in the Arab world that do not have to do with kind of deterministic claims about, like another thing that can be said about rentier state theory is that it has a kind of peculiar resonance with what I'm calling colonial economism. So if you read carefully the kind of formative texts of rentier state theory, what is implied is that at least in these places, there are people who are too susceptible to the availability of unearned easy wealth. And then like economic development gets all screwed up and you get authoritarianism, and somehow the Norwegians don't have this problem, right? And so we can notice that that's there in that form of political theory, but that then begs a set of questions about why it is that capturing state rents in these ways becomes an object of like real, genuine collective political aspirations by the middle of the 20th century. And so that is something I'm kind of thinking through. And I have what is really just a kind of hunch right now that story needs to be connected to another thing that is, I think, made more apparent by the moment that we're living through right now, which is the significance of hierarchies of monetary regimes to how capitalism is structured. In this regard, the 19th century, and Keynes wrote some incredible stuff about this right after World War I, where he basically notices that the 19th century is just utterly weird in the history of the world because it's basically the one period of time where the value of money is sufficiently stable that it's just not a major concern for all the kind of formative figures of classical political economic thought. And by the end of World War I, monetary values are all over the place, and this becomes a kind of going issue. And I think I'm now wandering a bit afield of your question, Reem, and also of Gabe's, but my suspicion is that the story that we have about sort of the proximate causes of the Suez Canal crisis being rooted in Dulles' yanking of funding for the Aswan High Dam has obscured a much more interesting story about how complicated it was to disconnect Egypt from a set of tethers to the pound sterling that were really like tightened actually during World War I. So weirdly, my like turn to I have beef with notions about the real. I'll say something about that in a second, but actually what has started to happen for me is more a kind of shift from a focus on finance to a focus on monetary regimes and how they work. And I guess, there's a strong invocation in some of the thinkers I'm looking at the end of the book of the significance of real wealth as opposed to financial wealth. And my basic take on that is that is often profoundly misleading and basically treats the production of value through the production of tangible commodities as if it's somehow more real than the production of value through financial instruments. And this has generated a whole variety of historical problems in all sorts of places. Okay, right. Okay, I want to say something. I think that this there were a bunch of questions about the specificity of Egypt and colonial economism. So absolutely, I think the fact that Algeria is a settler colony and Egypt is not is hugely significant. And I think that that's just a very helpful starting point for making sense of these distinctions. Another thing I meant to say in response to one of Amir's questions is it's also interesting that if you look at the texts that, the form of discourse about Egyptians, whether we want to say it's racialized or essentialized, that appears in the early chapters of the text Orientalism looks much more like what Miriam is describing than what I'm describing. And what's interesting is that if you look at the texts that Said is using, they are all written immediately after the moment of this shift that is described in the 7th chapter of the book. So there is that famous passage where Balfour gets up and says a bunch of hateful, very usefully, essentializing things about Egyptians. And he gives that speech in the same session of Parliament in which Edward Grey basically rose and said that all of these experiments with new forms of self-government are going to be shut down. So one can, I think, historicize slightly better some of the texts that are, used in incredibly generative ways in Orientalism, and kind of recognize that, colonial discourse could be essentializing, but the particular content of that, those essentializing claims could be historically mutable in significant ways. Now, to Matin's question, I think, yes, the fact that this was a society in which you had a large agrarian population that had a very long experience of, very deep incorporation into the world of 19th century commodity production and trade meant that there was actually kind of deep and widespread familiarity with a certain form of agrarian capitalism that already pre-existed the arrival of the British. The other thing that I touched on this at the beginning of the book, and it's a very interesting throwaway line at the very end of Robert Tignor's first book, and I really only started to think about how significant it was after the book was finished. But actually, the Ottoman context of Egypt mattered in a sort of unexpected way for this story. So it turns out that when Egypt went bankrupt in 1876, shortly thereafter, one of the things that the Ottomans did was to issue a firman that basically banned the contracting of any further public debt by the Egyptian state without the express permission of Istanbul. And so this meant that the forms of direct, what we would now call sovereign lending, that had been dominant in the middle decades of the 19th century and that eventually led the Egyptian state to go bankrupt and become kind of the original paradigmatic case of debt austerity, were not available to the occupation. There are a couple of moments where they kind of wiggle around it, but basically there is this massive constraint in that the Egyptian state cannot easily continue borrowing from banks in Europe. And that, I think, also played a significant role in allowing Cromer basically to make the case that this is going to become a space in which they can experiment with the use of other forms of privatized capital investment that were, not happening in other places. And so there are several very significant examples of this. So, the form of lending and investment that the book describes is one of them. If you have read my colleague Jennifer Durr's book about the Aswan High Dam, the funding of the dam happened by this very bizarre, convoluted mechanism where the contractors that were building the dam issued pay warrants, which are basically certificates that will make payments over a long period of time. And then Cassell created another company that bought those certificates and sold bonds to finance it. And so basically what they do is to float a public loan, but they can't do it directly. And the oblique mechanism ends up meaning that all of the intermediaries are able to profit massively from doing this. And this Suez Canal negotiation that I was describing in response to Reem's question is another manifestation of this. So after the crisis in 1907, the canal company was aware that the Egyptian government was strapped for cash, and they wanted to extend the concession. And so they basically say, we will, in exchange for your extending the concession by another 40 years, give you £4 million up front. And everyone at the time recognized that this was basically a very expensive loan by other means. And there's discussion in the archives of the fact that they're doing this because they recognize that the Egyptian government cannot lend directly. And so then several of these figures, I mean, Harb actually was the person that spent the most time doing this. There are these people that then spend months calculating the actual costs of these loans and basically determine that for an upfront loan of £4 million, this is going to cost Egypt something like £130 million over the life of the deal. So eventually it did not happen. But right, I think, this is in a sense an extension of the importance of paying attention to the particularities of the political situation. There were real peculiarities of the arrangements under which Egypt was ruled that certainly made some of these things much more likely to happen there than elsewhere. Should I shut up so that we can take a few more questions, and then I can maybe loop some more of these in?
Sarah?
All right, I'll take Henny's invitation to talk about colonial economism a little bit. First, thank you, Erin, for coming, and exciting book and exciting presentation, and thanks, Amir, for great comments. Okay, so I'm thinking through what your story about colonial economism is, and I guess I want to work with you on kind of whether I'm reading this correctly, whether there are other things you're trying to do with it. So I guess one of the things that struck me about it in the book is that there's an argumentative thread around almost a certain linearity to how colonial economism kind of becomes so dominant in the governing of Egypt. And as you're talking now about kind of the shift of the racial story, right?
Yeah, keep going. I just will. Yeah.
Okay. I sort of saw kind of wondered why we don't see a more kind of, I guess, more shifts and tensions in the story. So I read a very tense kind of relationship between Cromer and his staff and the investors, right? For example, in chapter 3, where they come in and kind of, all this funding is coming into Egypt, its logics look very different from what you're suggesting Cromer's logics are around colonial economism. And yet, there seem to be also ways in which they are working together, right, to produce this project. And I wondered why, and I wondered if perhaps there's more tension, there's more kind of going back and forth in the production of this project that you call colonial economism, or what becomes the governing of Egypt around a particular economic project. And that also kind of then opens up this question, which actually I'm getting from some of my students when we discuss this book in the last 2 years, is why do we, given the kinds of ways in which financial capital is not necessarily mapping onto a very clear project of colonial economism, but instead a much more kind of as a story that you would expect around, and specifically this idea of agricultural development, right? And the idea that the Egyptian peasant can invest, right? And the fact that a lot of these lenders won't give the Egyptian peasant the money, even though the government is kind of upholding this project, right? So that tension. then why do we take the government seriously, right? Because at the end of the day, they enable these investors in particular ways. And why do we think that Kremer and his staff are in fact practicing colonial economism rather than mobilizing it in strategic ways? So I guess I'm kind of curious about that. And then just to kind of close that off, just, is there a way in which you're seeing transformations around colonial economism, if we were to stretch this time period a little bit? Is this a very specific periodization of this project? Do you want us to stick to that periodization? Do you want us to see it? It kind of builds on some of the questions you've gotten about the post-colonial project. But anyway, I'll stop there. I have another question, but I'll stop there for now.
We can bring you back.
Yeah.
I actually really want to intervene on colonial economy.
Yeah.
Let's do it. It's the big. Right. I mean, you say this in the book. You said it in other places. You are actively taking on the Timothy Mitchell paradigm, right? So you concede in the book that the notion of the economy was something that emerged in the 1930s. But the thing that Mitchell has missed is the fact that there was something called the economic that actually came into emergence in the 19th century. So I'm kind of restating this so you can clarify if I've misunderstood. The second part of the argument seems to be that it's not sufficient for us to say that the economic in the 19th century is really just a kind of construction, that the political and the economic are actually imbricated, but that the economic represents something that is real, right? It's coming out of a real abstraction. And I think this is really interesting for us in terms of this series, because the last three talks that we've had, at the very least, each of them has been engaging one kind of binary, right? And I suppose I've said this in the last seminar, but one of the provocations of the modules, of the teaching sort of component of this seminar, is that colonial modernity is premised on a series of conceptual bifurcations. So the one that Nada Mumtaz sort of problematized for us was religion and economy. Alden Young problematized, I suppose, economy and race, thinking about how economic sort of technologies, vocabularies are racialized. Davis had a kind of triad, so she had economy on the one hand and then sort of race and religion on the other. And I suppose just to put it in the simplest terms, we've got the political and the economic in your text. But what seems to be different in what you're doing is precisely in this claim that the economic, this abstraction that you claim is sort of deployed in the 19th century, has a sort of reality behind it. And I think sort of the elephant in the room, or sort of in the text, if I could say that, of course, is the work of Moshe Postone and Andrew Sartori, and their particular, and their reading of Marx, and obviously My Skin Wood as well. But I'm thinking particularly sort of Postone and Sartori and their way of understanding why we think in terms of certain sort of abstractions. So I think it would be really interesting for you to maybe articulate a little bit more explicitly what you understand to be the relationship between political economy and specifically capitalism, and not just capitalism, sort of industrial capitalism, which is Moshe Postone's starting point, and I suppose concepts, right? So intellectual history. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, I thought it was really interesting that you assigned the chapters on nationalism. I thought that was really fantastic and really, sort of kind of provocative. Can we reach the conclusion that the nationalist, on the basis of your argument, that the nationalist movement in Egypt, the language that it ended up using, is simply just a product of these transformations in capitalist relations? Is this something that is emerging from the political economic transformations on the ground in Egypt that is pushing people to articulate liberation in the language of the nation and in the language of the political and the economic? If so, what are those transformations? Because wage labor clearly is not essential in this story. What we have is sort of credit-debt relations. Does that allow us to tell a kind of, sensitive story in terms of our post-colonial commitment, something coming sort of bottom up? Or are we sort of reinscribing a kind of Eurocentrism? Because in a way, we already know what's going to happen in every context we go to, whether it's Bengal, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Iran, we can predict that people are going to be using the language of freedom, politics, and economy in these ways. So I'll stop there. I have another question, but I don't want to abuse my role as the chair. Does anybody else want to weigh in? Otherwise, Sarah can come back. Joao?
Just to add to Sarah and your question, Henny. So obviously you mentioned that you don't disagree with Mitchell's framing of the economy as an object appearing in the interwar years. But okay, I'm just repeating what everyone just said, that you claim that there were these economist dynamics the years before, which show that it's not that simple, put it simple. But I wonder how incompatible one's position with the other is. And this is sort of just like building on what both Sarah and Henny said. If this is, because it is framed as a sort of critique, but critiques can be opposed or can build on or can be incompatible or compatible. I want to know what you, like, just to conclude on these questions, like what you think the compatibility is between both.
Sarah?
Yeah, not to like completely pile on, but just to kind of just to kind of, I guess, clarify, following these two questions, this idea, I guess what I'm really curious about is what's at stake here in this debate around the material. And especially curious how you feel about something like the notion of performativity that Michel Calon and then to Mitchell can mobilize in our understanding of the economic, right? Because it seems like when you get into the chapters, performativity is pretty important to you, right? It's mobilizing how you see the empirics in really important ways. And yet there's something at stake in the introduction, and I think that does carry through in the book also, in like, qualifying that in particular ways. And I guess I just wanted to kind of a space to see where that qualification is. Yeah. But also just like really curious if, especially for the first question I had, if I'm misreading what you're suggesting about colonial economism.
Yeah. I mean, it's just to add that we've been thinking with and against this book for the
For
last
a
couple of years in a very generative way and exciting way. We've been reading sort of the two texts together, or rule of experts alongside this. Adam?
Yeah, I wanted to come back, Aaron, to some comments you made in your earlier responses to some of the questions, and in particular, because I thought what you were saying about Sterling was really interesting, and I'm wondering what this story you're telling, or what the regional scale has to offer in terms of understanding the story you're telling. Because if we look at this beyond the borders of Egypt, and you've made the link with the US at the time, but clearly at this point you have the stirrings of kind of an oil-based global capitalism emerging. You have British colonialism particularly concerned with oil, perhaps a little bit later in time period you're looking at, but in terms of Iraq and the Gulf and Iran. You mentioned the Suez Canal, and then you have all of this linked to a British Empire where sterling is of absolute paramountcy. So it seems to me that kind of placing the kind of the ways in which the world market is emerging at this moment, in particular the role that the transition to oil is playing at that point, and therefore the importance of the region is part of the story of how the British view and understand occupation in Egypt as well. Beyond, I mean, I think the Suez Canal is obviously key to this, but beyond simply the Suez Canal as well. So I guess the question, put it straightforward, is like, what is the regional scale telling us about this story? Regional in the context of these transition in the world market.
Oh, sorry, Martine.
I just also wanted to, building on some of the other questions, want to hear your thoughts about how we might think about this distinction between economic and political. and the separate spheres that Meiskin Woods talks about, without recounting a diffusionist account of the histories of capitalism, and whether you think, I mean, also, second question really is, this division between economic and political, how much does it map out onto division between the material and the ideational, and this sort of ontological division of the world that we see at this time? Is it the same in just different wording, or and what are the stakes of calling that material economic rather than just material?
Yeah, I really like that question. I just want to, it seems that the operative category in the text actually seems to be material more than economic, at least on my reading. So the word that Chroma uses and some of your subtitles is sort of the material occupation as opposed to the economic. And sometimes I was sort of looking out for maybe the Arabic, especially when you start to talk about sort of the nationalist movement, kind of trying to reintegrate the economic and the political. Were they actually using, those terms? Or is this evidence of the kind of reintegration of the two spheres equally evidence that they were never really seen as disentangled to begin with? So it's kind of the evidence could sort of work both ways. Any sort of final thoughts before we allow Aaron to try to respond to some of them? At least I think the questions are thematically, similar.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to be, frankly, some of this is stuff that I'm also still thinking through. So eventually I will be sitting here waving my hands, but I will kind of calmly work my way into that, actually by revisiting Gabe's question as a way of starting to explain some of this. And I think also, I can sort of start by answering Gabe's question and Joao's question about Mitchell. So one of the things that changed between when I wrote the dissertation and when I wrote the book was living in the United States in the era of Trump. And the book, or I had a very basic intention in the book, beyond its historical content, to try to kind of draw attention to the way in which economistic claims circulate in the world around us, often as covert assertions of political disqualification of one kind or another, and that this long tradition of identifying economic determinism with a particular mode of Marxism has actually made the ubiquity of those kinds of claims very difficult to discern. So on some level, I care about different things now where the world keeps changing, but at the moment that I was actually sitting there writing the book, in fact, I was very exercised about how both Trump himself and his mainstream liberal critics in the United States were resorting to these very strange forms of economistic claims about Americans as political subjects that were basically ways of suggesting that only some people were really capable of overcoming their economic self-interest and doing real politics, whatever that was. And in response to, there have been questions about how I think about politics, but I think often the answer in those kinds of disqualifying assertions is often quite murky as it is made. And so to the extent that drawing attention to that problem as something that kind of exists historically in the world inside the history of capitalism became another thing that I had been thinking about when I was writing the dissertation that became more important to me, it suddenly became much more important to kind of foreground this issue and work through it. It was not my original intention to do this by way of planting flags in the ground to kind of center a disagreement with Mitchell, But it also became very clear that writing this book in this field, given the significance of Tim's work, it would be impossible to make those arguments without addressing them, because actually there is just a kind of basic empirical mismatch. Like, one cannot accept the specific empirical historical claim that is made about, the slippage, I think, helps to explain this, but if one actually accepts the claims that are made in Rule of Experts as written, it is impossible to explain, I think, how it is that somebody like Lenin was exercised by a problem he called economism in 1902, when the category of, like, the categorical distinction didn't exist for another 30 years. And to Joao's question, like, I don't actually think that needs to be a major source of disagreement. I think that the argument about the economy, as Tim makes it, is immensely important, and actually, like, its important continues to reemerge in a world in which invocations of the economy are mobilized as justifications for all sorts of political projects. I think it is not all that difficult to demonstrate empirically that there was a prior conceptual distinction between the economic and the political that had existed for a long time beforehand. And on those terms, I'm not actually sure, like, that for me is kind of the end of that part of the disagreement. I think, like, there's an empirical quibble, and without addressing that, I could not go on to explain the things that I was actually concerned with. I think there is also then a deeper question about how my account of the economic and Mitchell's account of the economy map on to two different ways of thinking about abstraction, or ways of describing two different kinds of abstraction. I think that Tim is absolutely right, and it is incredibly useful to think about the work that particular forms of generalizing abstraction do as technologies in the world, right? It is certainly the case that the kind of technical innovation of calculating GDP has utterly altered the politics of managing national polities all around the world since that happened. Like, that's a pretty strong claim. Again, I think it's difficult to account for the kind of long emergence of the discourse of political economy without recognizing that these were thinkers that were grappling in real time with social phenomena that were really novel in the moment that they were trying to make sense of them. And in this sense, you know, the story does get more interesting if one actually follows the lineage of political economic thought beyond the texts that as I understand it, Mitchell's version of the economy argument kind of begins with a particular reading of Foucault's reading of Rousseau's political economy in the chapter on governmentality. And Rousseau's political economy is different from the political economy of Adam Smith or of John Stuart Mill. So it is totally plausible to suggest that figures at one moment were actually thinking about political economy as a kind of scaling up of the management of resources at the scale of the household economy. And by the time John Stuart Mill writes this essay on some, I can't remember what it's called, essay on some questions in political economy that I cite in the introduction, he explicitly says lots of people understand political economy to be a simple matter of scaling up the household economy to that of the polity. This is a misconception. This is not what we are doing. And so, on that level, I have found, Sartori's work in particular, like, much more helpful in making sense of that formation of thought as it was taking shape than an account that I think I have not encountered a Mitchellian account of that trajectory of thought that holds together in quite the same way. And I don't think it's necessary to the most significant of the version of the argument that he is making, which, like, again, I also understand really in its earliest iteration to have been a kind of backward projection of one of the best accounts of what neoliberalization in the Middle East looked like. Like, I read Rule of Experts as a book that was written from written from the end, and everything that leads up to the last chapter is basically a kind of historical grounding of sorts of some of the arguments about what a set of claims that were being made in the historical present in which that book was written were actually doing in kind of asserting these kinds of divisions between the economic and the non-economic when they were like profoundly misleading and grounded in violence. Now, I mean, that's part of what was also at stake then in insisting on the analytical utility of a concept of real abstraction is that this also, for me, became one of the most helpful ways of making sense of what was actually going on in real time as this crisis was unfolding. So it wasn't like I didn't encounter this material with the intention of being like, oh, this is a real abstraction. But the thing that is quite striking if you're reading commentaries about this in real time is that there's this kind of endless effort to attribute these generalized social phenomena to specific historical actors and specific mechanisms in a way that would, conform much more comfortably with the kind of work that somebody like Couraille or Callan is doing. And what starts to happen in real time is that every one of those attempts to kind of describe the assemblage that would account for what's happening starts to break apart. And the moment at which crisis became, and that didn't mean that the category was not being deployed to produce particular kinds of narratives about what the crisis was, but the kind of growing perception that this was an abstract but like objective generalized experience started to have real purchase on a kind of collective experience out of which a whole new set of political possibilities seemed to start to emerge. So let me just, I think I probably only touched like fractions. Right, Sarah, your questions about, yeah, I mean, these are, I mean, you're in a sense touching on a way in which my comments at the beginning about consistency could be construed as defensive in a certain sense, right? So I mean, one of the problems that I would like continue to grapple with is I think there are certainly all sorts of ways in which one could demonstrate that, like, Cromera wrote and said all sorts of things about Egyptians that were like performative in a variety of ways, like politically targeted in a variety of ways, and not necessarily as serious and genuine as I might make him out to be in places. And one of the problems that I was working through in writing the book was to kind of try to emphasize the coherence of that discourse as it was experienced by its interlocutors. So like on some level, one of the concerns there was to actually take the nationalist movement seriously as the locus of like real political thought in motion required an attention to the set of problems that these thinkers were actually trying to deal with. And in a moment in which taking someone like Cromer seriously was not necessarily like an obvious or popular move in our field, that started to seem like something that was just analytically necessary, because actually, I mean, it's, right, and I think Amir, you had questions about this as well. If you read the period, the Egyptian paper, the Arabic press from this period, there was this kind of obsessive attention to every one of these statements that was made. So every time Cromer, like the annual report came out, every major paper in the country would run translations of it and then commentaries for weeks and weeks and weeks about all sorts of claims that were made. And there was an awareness, I mean, this also like played a role in the way that Egypt was constituted as a target of capital investment. So there was a kind of broad awareness that these statements had a readership in Egypt, but had a very broad circulation globally. And so dealing with them became, I think, a kind of practical necessity for many of these thinkers. But yeah, I mean, but I think that also means that it is likely the case that like emphasis on the coherence and consistency for that purpose meant that some of the kinds of things that you're pointing to, which I think are absolutely valid, end up getting kind of underplayed in the way the book was written. Rafif, I didn't answer your question. Oh, and Adam, regional scale. Oh boy. Okay. How we do? I have 1 minute. Okay.
Just a couple of minutes.
So, I think one of the things that started to become clear is that I think that like the regional scale starts to matter much more visibly immediately after the First World War. I mean, right? Like in a sense, the imperial presence in the region expands into new parts of the region, and the region starts to matter in new ways afterwards. And so, this is something that I have started to become much more interested in since finishing the book. And in the process of finishing the book, I have started to kind of follow the story into that later period where it starts to become much more important. So like one of the things I'm thinking about right now is basically that like the accounts of the, whatever one wants to call it, the economic history, the history of capitalism in the region that we have basically do not deal with the fact that like Egypt and all of the British mandates were part of the Sterling Zone in this period. And that just had like profound implications for all sorts of other things that were happening that we don't yet really like have just the basic empirical building blocks to make sense of. But we do know that certainly by the middle of the 20th century, like the story of world money and the story of oil are so closely entangled that I mean, this become like that connection became the, I'm running out of good metaphors. Right, I mean, became a flashpoint for like many of the most significant struggles that were taking place in the region. And Rafif, we will, I hope, talk more about this soon now. But I deliberately did not use the category racial capitalism in the book. Largely because I think that I understand processes of racialization to be one of a whole variety of possible mechanisms through which these kinds of unevenness are produced, and yeah, I'm gonna have to leave it at that. And just quickly, Martin, like your question about whether economic and material, economic and political maps onto material and ideational, increasingly, like since writing the book, the answer is no. And actually, I guess Reem is gone, but part of the reason for this is that I'm increasingly interested in the relationship between politically mediated and market mediated claims upon social wealth, and or now I'm fumbling. So to the extent that there is a story about the relationship between capital accumulation, fiscal regimes of states, and ideas about political orders, that I think like that tangle of issues is for me increasingly helpful in thinking through the ongoing history in which the regional becomes important, that in that sense, to the extent that politically mediated claims to and ways of organizing production, social wealth, labor persist even after the economic becomes a kind of meaningfully plausible concept, the distinctions don't map in such tightly binary ways.
I just want to say I really like this idea of plausibility, the plausibility of certain ideas, and I think there's actually quite a lot of overlap with Mitchell's work when he talks about effects. Just to sort of put that idea, the plausibility of certain notions, and certain notions being effects of, I would say, even material transformations that take place. But mostly I just want to say I really appreciate provocative work and challenging work, and it's been incredibly sort of exciting and generative for us at SOAS this year and last year to be, reading you and putting you in conversation with Mitchell and others. So thank you so much for humoring us and for answering the questions so generously. And join me in giving Aaron a round of applause.